Alrighty, we're ready to answer the question for you of how to make lobster bisque soup. Now, of course, in this DVD series on soups, you can click on the shrimp bisque or the oyster bisque, and you will find that the procedure, the ingredients, with the exception of the primary ingredient, lobster, shrimp, oyster, whatever, keep in mind there's only 4 really types of bisque soups: crayfish, oyster, lobster, and shrimp. They're the shellfish that are pureable or that you can get raw. Making a crab bisque is okay if you have raw crab to start with, but you always want to have raw shellfish when you start this soup, okay? So in the case of the lobster bisque, there's a question has come up from time to time among students of mine that making stock out of shells is a desirable thing. Let me answer that question a couple of ways. First of all, shell stock, if you will, tastes like shells, and lobster meat or shrimp meat tastes like shrimp or lobster. Now your soup will take on the flavor of the shells rather than the actual meat itself if you use shell stock in your bisque soup. You will notice as we make this soup today, or any of the other bisques that are in this series, that there isn't any shell stock or any other additive flavors added to it. These soups are proportionately designed in terms of the recipe for them to taste like the primary ingredient without adding any artificial or hyped up artificial flavoring of it, like lobster base or shrimp base. So we're going to answer the question of how this soup is made from scratch. And you'll find out why they charge so much for it in good French restaurants, okay? So let's begin by heating up our soup pan. And I'm going to put some butter in the pan, and then I'm just going to talk about the procedure for a second that we're going to go through. And you will find that this is the same procedure from the shrimp bisque and the oyster bisque. As soon as that butter's melted, we're going to add mirepoix to it, which I have right here, which is measurably accountable to the recipe that's in your PDF, if you can view that on your computer. And we're going to add that to the butter with a little bit of time. We're going to cook it halfway. We're going to add the lobster, and we're going to cook that 2/3 or all the way. We're going to add garlic. Then we're going to add white wine and reduce it. We're going to season or flavor the soup with a little bit of tomato concasse prior to the pureeing process. And keep in mind that when you're cutting the vegetables that go into the soup, it doesn't matter too much how they're cut because they're going to be pureed. Ideally, when you're making a bisque and you're going to puree the vegetables, you want to cut them small because it cuts down on the length of time that it takes you to make the soup in terms of cooking the vegetables in the stock until they get to a pureeable state. Okay? Now the butter is melted, and I'm going to add the mirepoix. And continuing on with that procedure, then we'll add some stock after the wine's reduced on top of the garlic, and then we'll add some rice to it because that's what's traditionally used, rice or boiled potatoes, but rice more than anything in terms of traditional French cooking, which is what bisque soup is all about, traditional French soup making in terms of bisque. I will mention, contrary to popular opinion, there are no other bisques besides shellfish bisque. So there really isn't a mushroom bisque out there. That's more of a marketing thing for some big soup company. But we won't get into that too much. We'll make our bisque with a little bit of thyme added to the mirepoix, okay? And I have here some fresh, live Maine lobster tails, which we're going to take out of the shell. But back to that business about the shell stock. There are some economic advantages that people in the commercial soup making business, as in restaurants and hotels, etc., they'll sometimes make shell stock as a supplement because they feel that they can't afford to make it with all the actual lobster meat itself, okay? Which I would disagree with that, meaning if you can't afford to make it right, why bother? Make something else that you can make right, you know? These are some very nice looking fresh Maine lobster tails too, I gotta tell you. This recipe calls for 1 pound of uncooked lobster meat. And that we have right here in these 5 to 6 ounce pieces of meat right here. We got about 15, 16 ounces right there. We're going to cut this up, and we're going to use and add that for the soup and the pureeing process. But we're going to take this other tail and we're going to chop it in slightly larger pieces and saute it and use it for garnish on top of the bowls. This is an added touch that would certainly be considered an option. If you can afford to have the lobster as garnish, then do it. If you can't, there's plenty of other garnish options that we'll go over when we're finishing and assembling the soup today. Okay? Okay, let's get this lobster cut up. The mirepoix is almost cooked. And again, you are not browning the vegetables. This is not a brown soup. This is, quote, a white soup, if you will. Okay? Now we're going to, let me give you a little peek at the veggies here. Richard, if you can come down here, you'll see that the vegetable about half cooked, half to 3/4. And that's good because now you're going to add the lobster while the vegetables are finished cooking. And we're going to let that cook. As soon as that's cooked, because you want the lobster to be sauteed prior to adding the stock to it. And we're going to use chicken stock today. And I also have some clam juice on hand. And sometimes you can add a little bit of clam juice too, and you can use that as your stock when you make bisque soups. Now, some people would recommend, or you will find in various recipes for bisque soups, the use of fish stock as the primary stock ingredient. Remember, shellfish, which is what the bisque soups are made out of, are not a fishy kind of tasting thing to begin with. So, although I have done it myself, and I'm not particularly fond of the final result from using fish stock as the primary stock in the bisque soups, but you can do it. I would kind of put that in your back pocket as an emergency stock. I would go with either white veal and poultry stock, or chicken stock, or clam juice, okay? None of these are fishy, and you don't want to add a fishy flavor to the bisque soup, because it's not supposed to taste like fish, because it isn't fish. Okay, lobster, about half cooked. Now we're going to add the garlic. And we have some chopped garlic. Now that looks like a lot. I got about 3 tablespoons here, and that's not enough. I'm putting the rest of this in here. So you got about 1/4 cup. Is that what my recipe calls for? 3 tablespoons. So I put about an extra tablespoon in. Okay. Brief cooking on the garlic, being sure not to scorch the garlic or burn it, God forbid, because it will permeate the soup with that flavor, and the flavor of lobster will no longer be dominating the soup. We're going to hit this with the white wine, and I think this recipe calls for 2 cups of white wine, and I got about 1.5 cups in there, 2 cups. There you go. Let's let that reduce for a second. And at this point, we can add the tomato concasse that I recommended we add. Now, this is an option. You don't have to have this tomato concasse in your soup. I think it kind of helps the flavor of the soup, and after you've made this and eaten it, you'll understand why. You can put it in just about anything, and it kind of helps it out a little bit. But you don't need a whole lot, keeping in mind that it's going to be pureed anyway. Now, while the wine is reducing, I'm going to fry some of the croutons that we're going to use in the final presentation for the soup.